Resident Evil is one of the longest standing horror series, being Capcom's top-selling franchise with releases still being put out in modern day, selling strong. Standing is one of the many titles etched forever into the history of many people's childhoods, but sadly, not mine. For a lot of people, the peak of the franchise was with Resident Evil 4, and when that game came out, I was 4 years old, so it wasn't even really an option considering I probably couldn't even hold a controller yet. And after all these years, when Capcom announced they would start remaking the original Resident Evil games with a fresh coat of paint, you could say I was interested. And seeing as it is spooky season, I think there's no better time than to give the franchise a well-deserved visit. I'm Sin, this is the Halloween special, and I finally played Resident Evil 2, 3, and 4. Hold on, you know what's scarier than zombies, ghosts, and ghouls? Ads. VPNs, mobile games, gambling and betting sites, stupid earbuds, or shoes no one cares about. That's why today's video is sponsored by you and the YouTube Join memberships. I really don't have to rely on annoying ads or mid-rolls just to make any revenue from a YouTube video. I don't like it, you don't like it, everybody loses. So, instead, I set up YouTube membership tiers as low as $1 a month. That way, I can afford to buy and play more games, as well as act upon my full artistic vision while criticizing and speaking honestly about the products that I come across. I've had a variety of benefits, and I'm working on more. Thanks so much for your support and time. Back to the video. Starting in order, we're going to play the most different of the three games. Resident Evil 2 is the definition of a survival horror. It manages to do almost everything right, and then as you'll learn, throw almost all of it away. The game breaks itself into three total segments: the introduction, the what, and the why. The order is both the most important part to how the game works, but why the game is also flawed. The game kicks off with probably the scariest and most disgusting cutscene in the entire franchise. Shortly after that character's much-deserved death, we're introduced to the main character, Leon Kennedy, the new rookie at the RPD, Raccoon City's police department, on his way into town for his first day. Stopping to get some gas, seeing the gas station is covered in darkness and there's nothing around but empty vehicles. Leon, of course, decides to investigate, because this is a horror game and we need a setup. You, as all rational people would do, go into the gas station completely alone, with no aid or without anyone knowing your whereabouts on the outskirts of town, with nothing but a gun and a flashlight, as any sensible human being would do. In the pitch black, you wander to the disheveled and messy store, finding a bleeding out employee. You push beyond to seize the threat, only to find a cop already handling a zombie. And due completely to your own distraction, the cop fucking dies. After a hasty exit and a run-in with a cute girl, because of course, you leave in a new cop car, freshly picked up off the dead cop you just got killed due to your own incompetence. After a brief encounter at the gas station, you head straight into town in search of answers, only to be reunited with that trucker in the opening cutscene, and what can only be described as the biggest possible cock block as he separates you and that girl you just met. Don't worry, she's not important for the rest of the game, and this is where the what segment begins. Entering the RPD, there's not much to do or see. No one's around, so you check the terminal, and on the cameras, you spot a cop in trouble. In usual Leon fashion, you immediately feel an overwhelming ambition to help said cop, which is where I now get to break down how the majority of how you spend your time here. In the RPD, you roam around dark corridors, with your only company being the infected police and survivors that succumb to their own peers due simply to a lack of information about the said virus. With this being a survival horror, keyword being survival, Capcom limits your resources heavily and sets one rule in place to not only aid the player, but aid the game's atmosphere. And that's the slower you go, the better. If you sprint, it alerts them. If you shoot, it alerts them. Your natural responses to a threat, fight, or flight makes everything harder on you. Instead, it's better to just dodge or simply walk past them. It builds this uncapped tension, built by our own response to fear of a threat in a dark hallway. It makes the dark, winding corridors and rooms of the RPD more terrifying. Not knowing what's around that corner, knowing full well how you want to respond is exactly what you cannot do. The silence as you shuffle past a zombie cop makes the bangs of the infected civilian at the window all the more loud and unsettling. Knowing you can't shoot them, but you can't stop them either. Not to mention the constant fake deaths. Those that lie in the room playing dead only to react when you walk near. It's cheap, but it makes you uncomfortable as you walk past them. And if you awake one and have to fight it, it could awaken or alert more nearby. All this took you to a room at the end of the hallway and, spoiler alert, the cop in the camera fucking dies. He gets ripped in half while in your hands, reinforcing what could happen to you. The same idea you got when you watched the cop die in the freezer at the gas station, both chosen specifically as cops. A distinct characteristic and important detail of the character we play as. The idea that this could have been him if he was just here a little earlier, with the only thing you gained from the experience being his journal, and now having to face the same hall that you just trekked across to get here. After all that, you head back to the safety of the main hall, only to be greeted by Marvin. Marvin is a cop who's been infected. He becomes the only recurring character while you remain in the RPD, and becomes the vehicle for your emotions about the virus. Marvin does something that only a character like he can do, and that's seeing the humanity behind those affected. With no prior understanding of what it was like to be in the RPD before the infections, or what the people were like, Marvin becomes your way of connecting to what would have been your peers, and giving you human attachment to your time in the RPD that you want to help to the best of your ability. Together, you discover in the Journal of the Dead Officer, he had found a way out. The statue in the main hall could be unlocked with 3 tokens. 3 tokens given by unlocking 3 statues strung throughout the building. The key to unlocking them is given to you in the journal. You just have to get to them. And that's where the labyrinth of the RPD comes into play. With the rules Capcom set being used as you explore unknown dark corridors and rooms with constant roadblocks forcing you to go back and go through areas for a key, a battery, or even a code. Along your journey, you can also piece a more social puzzle together when you go room by room and are able to read the individual and unique perspective and stories of those that would eventually fall victim to the infected. You get an idea of what the building was like when it was filled with life rather than the undead. The most uncanny of which being when you return to what would have been your own desk, and your peers had set up a cute introduction. How to unlock your desk. The solution is the first letters of each of their names, so you could get to know them. It's extremely unsettling when the character you put yourself into for some time now gets a heartfelt welcoming note from the people that he should have known. Now, through all this, there are 2 wrenches Capcom throws in the metaphorical wheel that is your progression. The Lickers and Mr. X. You see, the unease and discomfort of exploring the dark hallways will eventually wear off, due simply to getting used to the environment, learning the map, and understanding your enemies. So, to combat this, once the player starts to feel a sense of comfort, Capcom introduces a new enemy into the field. The first of which is called the Licker. Simply put, it's a skinless monster that can climb along walls and ceilings. But it's blind. It's stronger, but it lives with a harsher handicap that helps reinforce the rules of being slower and quiet. But the Lickers are only introduced in hallways with other enemies, meaning you have to deal with a normal infected or else you'll be punished with an exponentially harder enemy. But after everything, after solving all the puzzles strung to the RPD, finally, I set the tokens in and I got the fuck out of there. Expectedly, you end up in a boss fight, and after quickly passing it, you uncover the next part of the game. And this is where things start to get flawed and make less sense. After leaving the RPD, you end up doing the exact same thing you did in its parking garage. Going down long corridors, exploring, unlocking doors, and collecting pieces for what would be eventually your ticket out of here. And just like the main hall, you have a recurring character, Ada Wong, an FBI agent who becomes very important later. We'll get back to her. But the main issue with this segment of the game is you already sort of got out of the fear of this cycle. When you return to the previous game cycle, I no longer feel scared or vulnerable. So I have nothing to fear at this point. In fact, the new wrench Capcom throws in not only feels weak, but breaks the rules Capcom set previously. As you wrap up in this area, just as they did in the past, they introduce a new subset of enemies, the dogs. The dogs don't care if you're quiet or attack. They find you wherever you are. It's a rush to have to kill a quickly approaching enemy, but it lacks the tension built up by the slow-moving action of the last building. And if that seems bad, it doesn't hold a candle to probably my least favorite thing about this entire game. Not because it's bad, but because it's the single most anxiety-inducing enemy I've ever encountered in a game. Right as you're about to wrap up your escape in the RPD, once you've got past the infected, the halls are cleared, you've overcome the lickers, and you feel like you know the RPD like the back of your hand, everything changes when Mr. X shows up. He is a strong, unkillable foe who follows you wherever you go in the RPD. He doesn't follow you at a walking pace either. He's faster than your walk, but slower than your run. He's loud and nothing stands in his way. He tests that you know the halls and you know how to quickly handle the few infected left over because he's not going to wait. And if you mess up, he will kill you. You can stagger him, but that's it. Using all the weapons and ammo you've earned up to this point is useless. Everything you built up to upon this point is a joke to Mr. X. Even though I've seen him through memes and dumb mods on Twitter back when this game released, he still scared the ever-living shit out of me. And the moment you think you've outran him and you've lost him is when he spawns nearby. And all you hear are the approaching footsteps of a never-ending problem. Even when I got back to the main hall, the one safe space you have the entire game up until this point, Mr. X just waltzed through like he owns the place. And shit, he may as well. He can have the keys. I want to leave now. And the only thing standing between me and leaving is somehow both an immovable object and an unstoppable force. After solving everything, getting the keycard needed to leave, and a close call with Mr. X, Ada saves your ass and you leave. Properly, you are out of the RPD now. For real this time. And this is where you figure out the why. Why is this all happening? And how are we going to stop it? The second half of the game is completely tied around feeding the narrative of the story. No longer are you spending long hours in one area, but you're solving much simpler puzzles and moving forward to new areas. Mr. X becomes a recurring boss. There's a constant influx of new enemies, all of which wreak the same problems you come into in a parking garage. The genius of putting the what before the why has me attach myself to the people that used to live here and helps me paint a detrimental picture of what the rest of the world could become if you don't gain the sample of the virus. The humanity and great world building is the only thing that keeps me going in the second half of the game. It keeps me invested in the world and its characters even when the horror element of a survival horror is almost all but removed. And it makes the double crossing of Ada Wong at the end of the game all the more impactful. One last time, you fight Mr. X, finally kill him for good, and you escape via train, where you reunite with Claire. I really enjoyed this game. Flaws and all, it kept me engaged and present the entire way through. It's just too fucking bad that I can't say the same for the sequel. Resident Evil 3 manages to take none of the good from the previous and manages to double down on everything bad. No longer do you play as Leon or Claire, but instead you take turns swapping roles between Jill Valentine and Carlos Oliveira. You first take the role as Jill, a member of the STARS, an elite unit of the RPD. You're running an investigation into the Umbrella Corporation. Umbrella are the guys responsible for the whole outbreak. Oh, sidebar. This game starts before the events of Resident Evil 2, but the ending happens after the events are the same. Okay? Back to the game. Jill goes through a terrible dream sequence, foreshadowing what's going to unfold, then wakes up to a much worse series of events when the Nemesis breaks through her door, trying to kill her. No, that's not Mr. X, that's Nemesis. How is it different? It's not. He chases her through the building and destroys the whole thing in the process. Between weird camera angles and over-the-top action playing out as an overly scripted playable cutscene, in the first 10 minutes, it plays out exactly the same as half of the game does. Remember how in the first game, I talked about tension and feeling vulnerable? Yeah, this game does none of that. It's a fucking action game. There's no way around it. There's no survival. There's not really any horror. I never get attached to any of the characters. This game's a mess. Alright. After the building collapses on the Nemesis head, you roam the streets trying to find a way out of town. As the city falls to ruin, as the virus overtakes the streets, you run across town to a helicopter that will bring you to safety. And surely nothing bad happens to that helicopter. Uh-oh, the Nemesis isn't dead? Jill drives a car into the Nemesis straight off a building. And even though he just survived a collapsing building, blew up a helicopter, and she herself survived this fall, Jill, in complete ignorance, is amazed that a 20-foot tall monster somehow also survives. Is this how all of Jill's segments play out for the entire game? Yes. Yes, it is. Can we skip over her and completely lose nothing in the video? Yes. So, Carlos is a member of the special unit from the Umbrella Corporation. He's doing good for the bad guys. This becomes an internal conflict for Carlos when he realizes who he's working for halfway in the game. Most of his segments play out closer to the parking garage of the second game. It's the same roaming survival horror, but without the horror element, and a lot of that has to do with what I talked about earlier, the lack of vulnerability. Carlos, from the start of the game, is given a rifle, and all throughout the game, you're fed constant sums of ammo and health drops. So much that throughout the game, I actually have more than I need. There's never a concern of, what if I shoot? Because I know I have at almost any given time enough ammo to mow through a small crowd of infected. They introduced a new harder enemy, the Hunter Betas, but as mentioned earlier, there was never a build-up until this point, and the fast-moving enemies, though difficult, don't make me slow down or build tension. In fact, them appearing removes said tension. The way they introduce them is through another weird camera angle, seeing the world through the hunter's eyes, but this completely removes me from Carlos's perspective. Instead of giving me a loud thumping beyond the door like they did Mr. X, something to associate with him and fear the oncoming unknowing danger that only presented through sound cues, they gave me something that further separates me from the character I'm playing as. In the end of all this, you fight the Nemesis for seemingly the 100th time in what is a forgettable fight. The main antagonist, who I haven't mentioned until now because he's done nothing of note, destroys the antidote to the virus and dooms the city to be blown to smithereens. Resident Evil 3 is not only a letdown from the last game, it forgoes both the survival and horror aspects for what is just an action game. It feels like an extension or add DLC to the second game, rather than a horror experience that grows off of the former. It's an altogether regression in the rules and the world building that Capcom had well defined. Did I hate the game? No, but where I could see myself replaying Resident Evil 2 or recommending it to a friend, I think it's best for anyone interested just to skip over this title completely. The story is forgettable, the antagonist does nothing for most of the game, and honestly, doesn't matter. And the most prominent enemy in the entire game, the Nemesis, doesn't hold a candle to the former Mr. X, even though they fill the same role and are almost identical in their purpose. Mostly due to the fact there's never any build-up, nothing earned, and no merit of vulnerability, with a complete lack of humanity in a game all about saving a town full of people. The most surprising part of all this is the following release is the most ballsy double down by Capcom. Not only did they make another action game, but they made one of the most iconic games of all time in Resident Evil 4. So, how did they do it? How did they turn it all around? Funny enough, they followed closer to that of Resident Evil 2's formatting in giving you what you're dealing with long before the who or the why, and instead of the crazy kickoff that Resident Evil 3 had, they start in a more slow, calm, dark, prologue-esque setting. That way, they can build up from there and allow the player to invest themselves rather than the rampant action of the third game in characters I never had any ties to. Set up the world, then scale and unleash complete chaos. In the fourth game, you take back the role as Leon Kennedy, but after the acts of the second game, he was shipped off to become an elite member of a secret military group, completely devout as Anti-Umbrella Corp. Long and short, you're really cool now. And instead of being a measly little cop, you're a kick-ass elite special agent. Your whole point of the game is the president's daughter has been kidnapped and was sent off to, coincidentally, a rural area in Spain not far off where you're operating at. This is where the game starts. You head out to the area with 2 Spanish cops, and one of the smug douchebags disappears while taking a piss. And here comes the what you're dealing with. No longer is it zombies or giant monsters, but it's people. But something isn't right. They're absolutely entranced and vicious for seemingly no reason. After your first violent encounter with one of the village members, you walk through a horish, cult-like basement filled with bones, flesh, and the dead cop, only to turn around and have the same villager you just killed very much alive. Well, more undead than alive. And of course, this is a Resident Evil game, so we can probably assume something umbrella something zombies. But for some reason, it's different. We haven't seen an infected person without also seeing them being dead up until this point. It's an uncomfortable sight to see a human doing inhuman things, or being entranced and unresponsive. Funny enough, this game came out only some 5 years after the Blair Witch Project's release, which plays with a lot of the same ideas and is likely a huge point of inspiration for this game. And even though we can probably assume, since it's in the Resident Evil universe, it's probably just Umbrella, it's still so weird. Before we had an idea of what was happening, zombies have been in pop culture for nearly a century, but to suddenly change the rules of the world and you see the what you're dealing with, you're now inclined to ask why, who, and how. Replacing the zombies and monsters with villagers changes nothing categorically about their playstyle, but it changes the context of the entire game. Because inherently, if there's a human behind them, there has to be some degree of humanity or emotion. But when that's not the case, it's uncanny and a discomfort as deeply rooted in us as our identity of being human, and advantageously takes hold of our natural curiosity. After the short encounter, you roam to find a village in which they're burning the other cop left in the car at the stake. And for the first time, the areas you fight in are no longer small corridors or streets, but winding villages with back roads and passages, with small homes all to use your advantage in a more slow, stealthy approach if you choose so. Only almost always for something to go terribly awry, and the entire village heads straight for you in an overwhelming chaos. And just as you run out of ammo and you're overwhelmed by a mob of villagers, the church bell rings. And without hesitation, the entranced people walk into the church and no longer bother you. After fighting you relentlessly, all without bother, instead of answering questions, this whole sequence only raises more. Starting at the top of the list with, what the fuck? It's cultish and uncanny. Slowly, the game introduces your antagonist, each iconic in their design and performances, and all new enemies that become more monstrous the further in the game you go, with settings constantly changing, and though some sequences aren't nearly as interesting as others, they all build up the grandness of this problem, which at its roots is from the hands of a single person. The game reintroduces Ada Wong along with an all-new companion, Louise Sarah, and I think most importantly, the president's daughter. Though Louise had a very sad death scene after a very comical and sarcastic build-up of character in what is a very vulnerable and moving moment, the president's daughter is the single most important character. Many people find her annoying to escort a rather useless human being around, but she is the sole motivation for the entire game, and allowing you to keep her with you and speak during downtime in the game mirrors the game design of games like The Last of Us, which completely hinges itself off its relationships. Saving and working with her gives the player the entire motivation and sense of attachment, as annoying as she may be, just like that of a real kid. Annoying, constantly needing your help and repeatedly putting themselves in danger for no fucking reason. But for some reason, you still care. There could probably be a whole book written on the idea of human attachments in game design. Similarly, the echoes, the set pieces, level design, and so much more also mirror that of games like The Last of Us. Probably just as important, though, are the scenes in which you lose control. Early in the game, they put the same virus in you and the president's daughter as in the people of the village. The game constantly reminds you in multiple scenes that you don't have control. And at any point, as much as you resist, they can just as easily take away your control. It gives the player a vulnerability. Even after defeating so many giant monsters and huge threats, it gives you a new goal outside of just retrieving the president's daughter. And that's to regain control, to overcome your vulnerability. And that's why it's okay for the game to scale as far as it does. Because it's all to give a grandness to the threat in which you have to overcome, all for control over yourself. Just so you don't lose your identity as a human being like that of the village people. It's just as much for the president's daughter as it is for yourself. I could genuinely go on for hours about this game, walk you through each level and its characters and how much it does right. Even down to the quality of the remake being well above the past two remakes, from the gunplay, sound design, graphics, everything. But honestly, that would spoil so much of the game's fun. I'm so happy I got to play this game, and I completely understand why it stands out as the peak of the series. Even though it's not nearly as terrifying as the second game, its uncanniness and uncomfortable gameplay clearly spawned a slew of successors, including the modern Resident Evil games, that both clearly take huge inspirations from the fourth game. Resident Evil, even with a slight change and a fresh coat of paint, easily stands past the test of time. Considering that the series spawned a lot of modern games, it fits in perfectly among them. So it's no surprise the sales succeed to this day with its remakes or newer releases. Resident Evil is a cornerstone of not just the horror genre, but the entire games industry. I'm so happy I took a chance and decided to explore some of Capcom's catalog. And I implore you to do the same. Whether you've never played or you're just an old fan of the series wanting to watch someone's new experience, go take a dive back in time and experience one of the most amazing game series in gaming history. It's genuinely amazing, flaws and all. Resident Evil 2 gets a very strong 3 out of 5. Resident Evil 3 gets a very sad 2 out of 5. And Resident Evil 4 gets a very, very strong 4 out of 5. Hey! Thank you so much for watching the video. I stole this format off one of my favorite YouTubers, Reykjavik. If you want to check out some of his content, I will leave links down below and on the screen. If you like the video, go ahead and hit the subscribe button so you can catch the next one. I would love to hear your feedback and your own personal experiences of Resident Evil in the comments down below. This was a lot of fun to make and play. I actually recorded this in the middle of having terrible wisdom teeth pain. I actually have a surgery scheduled for about the same time this video comes out, so I hope it all pays off and comes out on time. But until next time, have a very happy Halloween. Bye-bye.